Military confrontations between Pakistani armed forces and Taliban-controlled Afghan forces occurred along the Pakistan-Afghanistan border on February 26, 2026. The clashes represent the most significant cross-border military engagement since the Taliban returned to power in Afghanistan in August 2021. Both governments issued statements claiming the other side initiated hostilities. The confrontations occurred along sections of the Durand Line, the colonial-era boundary that Pakistan recognizes as the international border, but which successive Afghan governments, including the Taliban, have not formally accepted as legitimate. The incidents raise questions about border security, regional stability, and the involvement of external powers with interests in South Asian geopolitics. This analysis examines 6 interconnected elements. First, the documented sequence of events and conflicting accounts of the February 26 clashes. Second, the mutual accusations regarding responsibility and the military operations each side claims to have conducted. Third, the specific claims about captured positions and casualties that remain unverified by independent sources. Fourth, the military capabilities of both forces and the strategic challenges inherent in the terrain and conflict dynamics. Fifth, the regional geopolitical context, including relationships with China, Russia, and Iran. Sixth, the brief connection to ongoing U.S.-Iran diplomatic efforts. Pakistani military sources issued statements on February 26, 2026, indicating that cross-border fire had been exchanged with Afghan Taliban forces along the border in Khyber Pakhtunkhwa province. The statements indicated that Pakistani military positions came under fire and that forces responded with artillery. Subsequent statements referred to aerial operations in support of ground forces. Afghan Taliban government sources, through statements from Ministry of Defense officials, described the incidents as Pakistani aggression against Afghan territory. Taliban statements claim that Pakistani forces initiated artillery strikes against Afghan border posts and that Taliban forces responded defensively. The sequence of events, as described by each side, is contradictory. Pakistan claims Taliban forces infiltrated across the border, prompting Pakistani response. The Taliban claim Pakistani forces struck Afghan positions first, prompting defensive retaliation. Without independent observers present during the initial exchanges, the question of which side fired first cannot be definitively established from available information. The location of the clashes spans multiple districts along the border in areas that have historically experienced periodic tensions. The Durand Line stretches approximately 2,640 kilometers and passes through mountainous terrain with limited infrastructure and sparse population in many sections. The border cuts through Pashtun tribal areas, creating ethnic and familial connections that transcend the political boundary. The Durand Line was established in 1893 through an agreement between British India and the Afghan Emir. The agreement created a boundary that divided Pashtun territories between areas that would become Pakistan and those remaining in Afghanistan. When Pakistan gained independence in 1947, it inherited the border. Pakistan considers the Durand Line the legitimate international boundary. Afghan governments have historically disputed this position, arguing the agreement was imposed during colonial rule and that the border artificially divides Pashtun people. The Taliban, despite controlling Afghanistan's government since 2021, has not formally recognized the Durand Line as the international border. Taliban statements have referenced historical Afghan claims to Pashtun territories in Pakistan. This creates structural tension where Pakistan defends a border that Afghanistan's government does not fully accept as legitimate. Cross-border movement has historically been common. Pashtun tribes have family connections on both sides. Trade routes cross the border. Refugees have moved between countries during various conflicts. Pakistan has constructed border fencing in some areas to control movement, which Afghanistan has protested as unilateral action on disputed territory. The border areas have also served as routes for militant groups. The Tehrik-e-Taliban Pakistan, distinct from the Afghan Taliban, has operated in Pakistani tribal areas and reportedly used Afghan territory for sanctuary at various times. Pakistani security operations have targeted TTP positions, sometimes involving operations near or across the border. These dynamics create recurring friction over sovereignty and security control. Both governments frame their military actions as responses to provocations by the other side. Pakistani official statements characterize Taliban forces as having violated Pakistani sovereignty through border infiltration and attacks on military positions. The statements emphasized Pakistan's right to defend its territory and citizens. Taliban government statements characterized Pakistani military actions as unprovoked aggression against Afghan sovereignty. Taliban officials stated that Pakistan has conducted unauthorized military operations in Afghan territory and that Afghanistan has the right to defend itself against external attack. The tactical operations described by each side include use of artillery, which both governments confirm occurred. Pakistani sources indicated that Pakistan Army artillery units engaged targets across the border. Taliban sources similarly described artillery exchanges. Pakistani military sources additionally claimed use of air assets in the operations. Pakistan operates combat aircraft, including F-16s and JF-17s, capable of precision strike operations. Whether aircraft actually conducted strikes and what specific targets were engaged has not been independently confirmed through satellite imagery or other verification methods available to outside analysts. Taliban sources did not claim to have employed aircraft, which aligns with the documented fact that the Taliban do not operate fixed-wing combat aircraft. The Afghan Air Force that existed under the previous government collapsed during the Taliban takeover in 2021. The Taliban inherited some helicopters but do not maintain operational fighter or attack aircraft. The claimed objectives of operations differ in the statements. Pakistan framed operations as counter-infiltration and targeting militant positions. The Taliban framed operations as defense of Afghan territory against Pakistani encroachment. A Taliban government spokesperson made specific claims on February 26 regarding operational outcomes. The spokesperson claimed that Taliban forces had captured 15 Pakistani military posts along the border. The spokesperson additionally claimed that Pakistani soldiers had been taken prisoner, though specific numbers were not provided in initial statements. These claims have not been independently verified. No international observers, journalists, or third-party organizations have confirmed the capture of Pakistani military positions. Satellite imagery analysis, which could potentially verify changes in control of fixed positions, has not been publicly released by commercial satellite companies or analytical organizations as of February 27, 2026. Pakistani military sources issued counterclaims describing successful operations against Taliban positions. Pakistani statements claimed destruction of multiple Taliban border posts and infliction of heavy casualties on Taliban forces. Specific casualty numbers were provided in some Pakistani media reports, citing military sources, with figures ranging from dozens to over 100 Taliban fighters killed. These Pakistani claims similarly lack independent verification. The Taliban government has not released casualty figures for its own forces. Independent confirmation of battle damage and casualties is extremely difficult in border areas with limited access and no international monitoring presence. The pattern of conflicting and unverifiable claims is consistent with information warfare dynamics in military confrontations. Both governments have incentive to present their military performance favorably and to emphasize enemy losses while minimizing or denying own losses. Without independent verification mechanisms, competing claims remain in dispute. Historical precedent from previous Pakistan-Afghanistan border incidents shows similar patterns. Following clashes in 2022 and 2023, both sides made claims about military successes that could not be independently confirmed. Casualty figures provided by governments engaged in conflict are generally considered unreliable by military analysts, absent independent verification. The military balance between Pakistani forces and Taliban forces involves significant asymmetries. The Pakistani military is a conventional armed force with approximately 650,000 active personnel, modern equipment including tanks, artillery, combat aircraft, and professional training and command structures. The military operates under unified command and maintains sophisticated logistics and communication systems. Pakistan's military-industrial capacity includes domestic production of certain weapon systems, including the JF-17 fighter aircraft developed with Chinese cooperation. The military maintains strategic relationships with China and the United States, though the U.S. relationship has experienced tensions over various policy issues. Pakistan's nuclear weapons capability, while not directly relevant to border clashes, affects broader strategic calculations in regional security. The Pakistan Army has extensive experience in counterinsurgency operations from years of fighting militants in tribal areas. Operations from 2004 through 2018 involved large-scale military campaigns against TTP and other groups. These operations provide institutional knowledge of mountain warfare and irregular conflict. However, operations within Pakistani territory differ from operations across an international border where political constraints and logistical challenges increase. Taliban forces consist of irregular fighters who transitioned from insurgency to state control following the 2021 takeover. Estimates of Taliban military personnel vary, with some assessments suggesting 70,000 to 100,000 fighters. The Taliban inherited equipment from the former Afghan National Army, including small arms, vehicles, and artillery, but lack the maintenance capacity and training for sustained operations of complex systems. The Taliban's military advantage lies in motivation, knowledge of terrain, and proven ability to sustain operations with minimal logistics. Taliban fighters endured 20 years of warfare against technologically superior forces and maintained organizational cohesion. The transition to controlling state territory creates new challenges, as Taliban forces must defend fixed positions rather than operating purely as mobile insurgents. Taliban force structure remains somewhat decentralized. Regional commanders maintain significant autonomy. Unity of command from Kabul to all field units cannot be assumed. This creates both challenges and opportunities for Taliban military operations. Decentralization allows flexibility and local initiative, but complicates coordination of operations across multiple fronts. The conventional military advantage lies clearly with Pakistan in terms of firepower, air power, logistics, and combined arms capability. In a sustained conventional conflict, Pakistani forces would be expected to achieve tactical successes against Taliban positions. However, the terrain and operational context create significant complications. The border region is mountainous with limited road access. Artillery and air power effectiveness is reduced in mountainous terrain where forces can use terrain for protection. Ground operations require infantry forces capable of operating in difficult terrain, where Taliban fighters have significant experience from decades of mountain warfare. The Taliban employed insurgent tactics successfully against NATO forces and the previous Afghan government for 20 years. These tactics include ambush, hit-and-run attacks, use of terrain for concealment, and ability to disperse and avoid concentrated forces. If Taliban forces choose to avoid set-piece battles and instead conduct asymmetric operations, Pakistani military advantages in conventional firepower become less decisive. The strategic challenge for Pakistan is whether military operations can achieve sustainable security outcomes. Temporary occupation of border areas is tactically feasible. Permanent control requires sustained presence, which creates force protection challenges and resource requirements. The Soviet Union and NATO both experienced difficulties in controlling Afghan territory, despite overwhelming conventional military superiority. Pakistan would face similar challenges if attempting to maintain positions deep in Afghan territory. The geopolitical context includes relationships between regional and major powers. China maintains significant interests in both Pakistan and Afghanistan. China shares a small border with Afghanistan and has invested substantially in Pakistan through the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, part of the Belt and Road Initiative. Chinese investments in Pakistan exceed $60 billion in infrastructure and energy projects. The Taliban government, while ideologically distinct from China's governing system, has engaged in diplomatic and economic discussions with Beijing. China has maintained its embassy in Kabul and conducted ministerial-level meetings with Taliban officials. Chinese concerns include security of regional investments and prevention of extremist groups from using Afghan territory to threaten Chinese interests in Xinjiang. A Pakistan-Afghanistan conflict creates complications for Chinese interests. Instability along the border threatens CPEC infrastructure security. Pakistani focus on Western border operations diverts resources from other security priorities. Afghan instability could enable extremist groups to expand operations. China has historically played a mediating role in Pakistan-Afghanistan disputes. Chinese diplomatic interventions have previously encouraged dialogue and de-escalation. Whether China will actively mediate the current crisis remains to be seen as developments are ongoing. Russia has similarly engaged with the Taliban government following the U.S. withdrawal. Russia hosted Taliban delegations in Moscow and maintained diplomatic contact. Russian interests include preventing instability from spreading into Central Asian states, where Russia maintains security relationships. Russian and Pakistani officials have conducted discussions on regional security issues. Iran shares a border with Afghanistan and has complex relationships with both the Taliban and Pakistan. Iran has concerns about water rights from shared river systems, refugee flows, and border security against drug trafficking. Iranian officials have engaged with the Taliban government on these issues. The regional balance involves competing interests. Pakistan has security concerns about terrorist groups using Afghan territory. The Taliban government has sovereignty concerns about Pakistani military operations. Regional powers have interests in stability to protect economic investments and prevent extremism from spreading. Separately from the Pakistan-Afghanistan clashes, U.S.-Iran negotiations continued through Omani mediation channels on February 26, 2026. These negotiations concern Iran's nuclear program and have been ongoing intermittently since early February. No agreement has been reached as of February 27th, but both sides have agreed to extend negotiations beyond initially expected deadlines. The connection to the Pakistan-Afghanistan situation is primarily geographical and contextual rather than direct. Both situations involve regional security dynamics in South and Southwest Asia. Iran's interests in Afghanistan's stability connect to its concerns about refugee flows and border security. Pakistani and Iranian officials have discussed regional issues, including Afghanistan, in bilateral meetings. The extension of U.S.-Iran negotiations indicates continued diplomatic engagement despite lack of breakthrough. The willingness to extend deadlines suggests that both sides view continued dialogue as preferable to breakdown, though fundamental disagreements on nuclear restrictions and sanctions relief remain unresolved. To summarize the core analytical findings, military clashes occurred on February 26, 2026 between Pakistani armed forces and Taliban-controlled Afghan forces along the Pakistan-Afghanistan border. Both governments claim the other side initiated hostilities, creating contradictory accounts that cannot be independently verified. Pakistan and the Taliban both describe military operations using artillery and, in Pakistan's case, air assets. Taliban claims of capturing 15 Pakistani military posts and taking prisoners remain unverified by independent sources. Pakistani claims of destroying Taliban positions and inflicting heavy casualties similarly lack independent verification. Pakistan possesses overwhelming conventional military superiority but faces strategic challenges from terrain, Taliban asymmetric warfare capabilities, and the difficulty of achieving sustainable security through military means alone. Regional powers, including China, Russia, and Iran, have interests in Pakistan-Afghanistan stability and may attempt mediation. U.S.-Iran nuclear negotiations continued separately with deadline extensions, but no agreement. What remains uncertain is which side actually initiated the February 26 hostilities, what the actual casualty figures and territorial control changes are, whether the clashes will escalate into sustained conflict or de-escalate through diplomatic intervention, how regional powers will respond, whether either side can achieve strategic objectives through military means, and how the incidents affect broader regional security dynamics. The key variables shaping future developments include political will on both sides to continue or de-escalate military operations, effectiveness of regional diplomatic mediation efforts, particularly by China, ability of both governments to control border areas and prevent recurring incidents, internal political dynamics in Pakistan and Afghanistan regarding the value versus cost of military confrontation, and the response of Taliban field commanders versus Kabul Central Authority to operational directives. Further analysis requires monitoring of additional statements from both governments, any independent verification of battlefield claims through satellite imagery or other means, diplomatic interventions by regional powers, and whether military operations continue, expand, or de-escalate in coming days. The information environment is characterized by competing claims lacking independent verification, requiring careful attribution and acknowledgement of uncertainty regarding specific operational details.